Kickstarter is an unpredictable beast, isn't it? I sometimes find myself thinking about how terrifying it must feel to launch one of these campaigns as a game dev. Yeah, alright, let's just take our cynical hats off for just a moment here. It seems to me that you would need such an incredible, inhuman level of foresight to not immediately start messing things up, right? From day one, the only thing that you know for certain is that you will not raise the exact amount of money that you're asking for. You just won't. You can't. You'll either fail to reach that figure and never see a single crowdfunded penny, or you'll overshoot that amount, perhaps by a lot. And perhaps that's with the aid of stretch goals, promising more stuff, or maybe the Kickstarter crowd just decides that you're worth more money than you've asked for. Your video game sounds great and now you can make it even better, can't you? Well, you should, because we gave you extra money. That's how that works. Yeah. It's all a bit vague, and I think most sane people get that there's a pretty big risk involved in backing a Kickstarter promise, but we do it anyway. Maybe not quite to the same level that we did in 2012, because that was really bonkers, but we still crowdfund the hell out of all sorts of stuff. It's like Game of Thrones meets EVE Online, says hopeful MMO Crowfall. Yeah, that sounds kind of optimistic. Over $1 million raised, 17 days to go. Alright. So maybe we are a bit naive, but our continued optimism has also been responsible for some really cool stuff along the way. Let's try not to forget that. Look at the Banner Saga. I really like this game. It's turn-based strategy and absolutely gorgeous, and it has Vikings in it as well, which is often a major plus. And it's really interesting to think what this game might have looked like if Stoic had gone down a more traditional, publisher-funded path instead. Would it have been considered a bit too niche? A bit too expensive, a risk that might not pay off? Maybe, and I'm really glad they never had to have that conversation. But not every Kickstarter is the Banner Saga, unfortunately. Given the sheer number of projects that we've thrown money at, and how relatively new this entire model for funding game development actually is, well, it was inevitable that some of them would be a bit rubbish. So what happens when a project does fail to meet the expectations of its backers? You've likely heard enough about Goddess over the course of February to have some idea. And well, yeah, it just doesn't make for very fun reading. Everything feels much more personal somehow, and I guess that's actually because it is. The relationship between players and developers has changed, because if you're asking somebody to directly fund your project, well, you can also expect that person to be more critical of the mistakes you make, particularly so if there's any suggestion that you're chasing something that wasn't discussed during your initial pitch. DLC, microtransactions, oh, those are probably words you want to stay away from. And there's not going to be any big, menacing publisher to point the finger at this time around. No shadowy overlord to blame. And if there is, that's going to be your fault as well. Now, there are a whole list of reasons that dictate whether or not a game is likely to get funded on Kickstarter. You'd like to think that one of those would be the strength of the idea itself, and of course, how easy that idea is to convey to prospective backers. How much money actually needs to be raised for this to be considered a success before development can get started. This is all pretty important stuff. But there is also another key factor that you need to be thinking about, and that's trust. Now that's a really difficult one to quantify, isn't it? I mean, do you know the team involved with the project beforehand? Have they made games before? Do you recognise those games? Are they good? And probably one of the more interesting ones that we're going to run into now is, have they used Kickstarter before, and how well did that go? This has already happened, by the way. Look at the team behind Shadowrun Returns. Back in early 2012, when Kickstarter was all good times and good vibes, they raised a staggering $1.8 million to get that off the ground in the first place, and people clearly liked it enough to go ahead and fund a second campaign for Shadowrun Hong Kong just last month. Another $1.2 million. So it can work both ways, clearly. Kickstarter, despite the name, has the potential to be more than just a way of getting the ball rolling on weird, wonderful, individual projects. It could, at least for some, provide a sustainable way to fund an entire series of games. But you can't afford too many missteps along the way if that is your goal. And I don't know if Kickstarter as an entirety can weather too many more either, because it is the failures of Kickstarter that often dominate the conversation. Goddess is the big story this month and now joins the likes of Yog Ventures and Clang. These abandoned or failed games that serve as gigantic warnings for anyone thinking about backing Kickstarter campaigns in the future. And it's completely justified, but also completely frustrating. I mean, we finally got this new way of funding games that just wouldn't exist otherwise, or if they did, would have to go through some serious redesigns to ever get that far. So I guess what I'm saying, all in all, is go and play the Banner Saga, because that's what this whole thing should be about. It's weird and unusual and probably wouldn't have got funded or look anywhere near the same without Kickstarter. And yeah, alright, crowdfunding brings with it some serious risks, and people are going to exploit that or just make a mess of it, and your money's going to be wasted as a result, but sometimes we get cool stuff with big Vikings in it. And that's alright.